Okay, good morning, Mr. Bustamante.
Good morning.
This is Heather Barrett. I'm with Amatera Environmental, and it is July 25th, 2013, and we are here to talk with you about the Utah Launch Complex.
That ought to be interesting.
Yes, it is. And if you could state your full name for the record, and if you'll tell us briefly what, in the late 50s and 1960s, what function you had at White Sands Missile Range.
My full name is Carlos Armando Bustamante, and I was a civil engineer graduate working in 56, 57 in the headquarters, the command group. It was the mission plans and operation, the old G3 structure of the government, and there was 3 people between the general and I. I was a branch chief and the staff engineer for all of the work going on at White Sands that White Sands supported, the missile programs that were surface to surface oriented.
And our purpose here is really to talk about Green River and the Utah Launch Complex. So I'd like to just start by asking you a little bit about that program and how it came about, in particular the ABRIS program, and to talk to you about the function of Green River.
The ABRIS program is an Air Force program, and it's from the Air Force System Air Command in Andrews, but it was the Strategic Air Command and the Ballistic Missile Division of the command that was exercising this program. It was a very big, broad program that had been initiated early in the 1950s. And it's ABRIS is an acronym for the Advanced Ballistic Missile Reentry Studies. And this involved a lot of work in a lot of places. At White Sands, it started in the mid-50s, in fact, by sounding rockets, sending payloads up into the lower altitudes of maybe a couple 100,000 feet, dispensing chaff clouds, obscurants, and other tests objectives for the payloads that would ultimately be designed for the intercontinental ballistic missiles. Also, there was work being done at Wallops Island in Virginia and at the Cape. So the requirement came to work on scale models of the actual re-entry warheads or payloads that the ICBMs would carry in operational circumstances. Now, these were scale models, and that required a test where you had land instrumentation so they could observe the head-on aspects of the radar cross-section of the re-entry bodies that re-entry into the atmosphere. And this is a good 70, 75 miles up. And also from not only a head-on aspect, but from a side-viewing aspect also, as they re-entered, to determine the effectiveness of the penetration aids that would be required to offset the enemy's defense systems. So you were getting into countermeasures and countermeasures and multiple payloads and decoys and tricks and things like that. And that was the reason that White Sands was chosen to conduct these tests with impacts into an instrumented area.
And you had talked about there are a couple of different angles they were also testing.
Well, yes, the objective of the test was to bring in an actual simulated, scaled warhead, if you will, into the atmosphere at several angles varying from 15 degrees to 45 degrees. And these were essentially called low reentry angles, and high reentry angles. But it wasn't just a trick of bringing them in at that angle. The actual vehicle had to have an attitude plus or minus 5 degrees as it did re-enter the atmosphere of whatever angle it was. So it was a very critical tests, and a lot of data was required for them.
And let's talk a little bit about finding the site of Green River and how that came about. I understand that there were various studies of different locations, and so how was Green River selected? It
was a study conducted by the White Sands Missile Range and also the Air Force people, and including the Atlantic Research Corporation, that was under contract with the Air Force to be launching these test vehicles to produce these reentry phenomena. Now, the reason for the validity of flying missiles over land had been established prior to that, back in 1950, I guess, 3 or 4, with the concept of White Sands had the potential of being a launch site for missiles flying over land over very, very light population densities up to the northwest corner of the United States, up to and including Alaska.
And are there other launch complexes that had as long of a flight corridor during this period over land?
Not during that period. The first overland firings we had at White Sands was in '63 from, and that was the Sergeant missile that was fired from the plains of San Agustin in New Mexico, which essentially is where the NASA's large array radars are. And that was to fire missiles from west to east trajectory to check the Coriolis effect, that is, the spinning of the Earth versus the navigation and system of the missile. That was the first one. And then in 1963, also the Pershing 1A started, and that was another launch system requirement that was established at various points outside of the boundaries of White Sands, starting with McGregor here at Fort Bliss, Texas, firing north, and then from Fort Wingate near Gallup, Arizona, New Mexico. Then the longer ranges were to be fired from Blanding in Utah, which is about maybe 100 miles south and a little east of Green River.
So it sounds like this was a pretty, as far as the length of the corridor, that it was pretty rare, or pretty long for the overland flight coming out of Green River.
Yes, it was. It was close to 500 miles and a little less. But nevertheless, it was still a sensitive issue because we would have to have boosters dropping into areas downrange from the launch point, in addition to the payload impacting in a dispersion zone that could possibly be outside the boundaries of the missile range. And the safety issue was the predominant thing. So that's the way we handled it. So we had 2 or 3 different off-range co-use areas that we leased by agreement with the landowners for evacuation during the missile firings.
And talk to us a little bit about the studies before the Utah Launch Complex in Green River was selected. You were looking at, you touched on this briefly, you were looking at things like population density and what else? We had the concept, it was early in 1945 in fact,
when the missile range was first established, it was surveyed, and the boundaries were outlined by one of the directors of the development of White Sands, Mr. Herb Karsh. And he had a registered land surveyor, Mr. Charles Brink. And in 1945, they were looking at a map of the United States with the size of White Sands on it and the amount of real estate that they had just identified to be later known as White Sands Proving Ground. Then they realized that, gee whiz, they have a long-range potential to fire missiles within White Sands of 100 miles. So then they just realized by looking at a map of the United States that the areas to the north and west was very, very low in population density. And so the concept caught on, and we decided to just look into it a little different, more deeply. So we actually went out and surveyed potential impact areas, not as launch areas, but impact areas of 100, 150, 200, 250, 500 miles up into Alaska. And not only did we just identify the areas because of the low population, but we actually sent survey teams to count people. And we counted railroads and utilities and communications and airspace and all of these things that would assist us in feasibly considering those areas for co-use with the landowners and business owners for possible use later on. Yes, it wasn't a pipe dream, but it was something that was conceivable, and it was studied, and very well studied. And little did we know that it would become a reality.
And talk to us a little bit about the visit to Green River, the initial visit, and who was involved with that, and what did they find that made this particular site so attractive?
Well, we, the government at White Sands and others, did not select Green River per se. We selected the launch site for the Athena program missile to be at Blanding, from which we were also going to fire the Pershings from Blanding into White Sands, the Pershing 1A. So it so happened that the Department of Defense, Dr. Harold Brown, dictated that, okay, the tests will be done at White Sands and a remote launch site is required, but it would be a very austere, minimum cost, and no more than a 2 or 3 year, 10-year impact for facility preparation and use. And in so doing, some Air Force people were driving west through Highway 50 through Green River, going I don't know where. They were probably going from Blanding up to Salt Lake City or something. But anyway, they drove by Green River and saw this vacant Union Carbide uranium ore mill. And they said, aha, that could save a lot of time and money and comply with the Department of Defense objective. And we'll use that as a missile assembly and preparation building. And that'll save a lot of money. And so they convinced higher-ups and things that that's the place to go. That's how Green River got identified and approved. So it wasn't selected per se, but it was became a reality.
And so they didn't know about the mill until they were basically going through, or they didn't think about the mill for that purpose until they were going through.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And so as they're making this selection and thinking about the infrastructure that's going to need to occur there, what are some of the initial things in layout and equipment that are needed to set up such a complex site?
Well, there the responsibility was solely that of White Sands Missile Range, because they would be the manager and responsible agency for the operation and control of the Green River area, or the launch complex at Green River. With the exception that the Air Force leased the Union Carbide uranium mill building, and that it was retained as non-White Sands property. However, White Sands did and insist and was the agent for safety in that mill in the surrounding areas as well as the site itself. So the layout of the requirements as to what was needed to establish the launch complex potential before the Athena included a lot of basic things. One was identifying the scope of the operation with respect to missile preparation, safety issues, population on site required to support not only the operation, the test operation, but also the post-camp and station per se of safety, fire, medical, mess hall, billeting, all of these things, and building the blockhouse and other instrumentation facilities, and just a multitude of things, logistics, water, electricity, gas, all those had to be recognized, designed, outlined, and enumerated, which became a pretty healthy laundry list because there was absolutely nothing there. And it was even hard to find a lizard because it was pretty desert stuff. So the White Sands personnel responsible for all of these elements took part in laying out the complex as most efficiently as possible to minimize the actual land mass coverage that would be required, while the Air Force and the Atlantic Research Corporation maintain their preparation of the Union Carbide facility for supporting the operation, which incidentally it cost some $13 million to refurbish that building, which would probably have been less to build a new one to begin with. But that's anyhow. So the requirements were outlined by the White Sands staff, and then through the Corps of Engineers, who were now the Action Office for Land Acquisition and Major Construction Management, they awarded a contract to Ralph Parsons in California, in Santa Monica. They would then be responsible for actually designing the blockhouse and the major support requirements such as water systems, fire hydrants, utility systems, identifying the medical facilities that would be required, and any major construction of the support complex itself, including the environmental movable shelter that was housing the missile just prior to launch. So all of those things came under the purview of the White Sands Missile Range management and engineering and command staff personnel.
And you and I have talked about this a little bit, that on the drawings, there are names of different firms. And so I've got one here that says Daniel Mann Johnson Mindenhall, Johannesson and Gerand, architects and engineers from Los Angeles and Phoenix. Do you think Parsons oversaw.
May I see that, please?
Yes. And this is just for one of the buildings in the cantonment area. It's kind of hard to read because it's pretty small. Do you think these firms could have been subcontracted by Parsons?
They probably were. They probably were. And as you notice, this is the Department of the Air Force drawing. I mean, it's not a White Sands Missile Range file copy. So, and it's a temporary, low-cost structure. So the heavy-duty stuff, that is the blockhouse and things, was retained by a major contractor. These architects that you just mentioned, they were not the heavyweights, if you will. Okay. They were efficient, good contractors, don't get me wrong. But subsequent to that, after the initial construction phase, which lasted from 63 to 64, of the primary hard shell facilities, many other things popped up as a requirement. For example, we White Sands Missile Range, contracted Northland Camp for about 300 or 400 trailers to be laid out and provide the mess hall, billeting facilities, and that's where support personnel lived without impacting Green River. The town of Green River didn't have the capacity to house and support a contingent like that. And so as time went on, and as the duration of the program continued far beyond the 2 years, many other little requirements came in, and other Pershing came in and fired from that area also. But there was a site manager, and I appointed Mr. Taylor, Julian R. Taylor. He was from Alamogordo, and he was working at White Sands, and I recommended him to the command to be the site manager, and he was approved. So he, as a site manager, had construction approval authority up to some limited amount of funds, and where he could contract directly with the local economy for minor things, which could have included even a building such as you just mentioned by Dim Jim. And he could have exercised a contract through the Air Force however he had to. Anything that wasn't considered permanent real property, it's a temporary building, and those are handled a little bit differently. And that's why you have a lot of mix, and they could have used a multitude of small construction contractors, not only in Green River, which there wouldn't have been many, but in Grand Junction there would be several, and even in Moab and other places in Utah they would be available to support for minor construction things. So you'll run into a lot of drawings with different things that are of lesser importance.
And so the more permanent structures you'd consider like the blockhouse.
The blockhouse, and there were some igloos required to house the squibs for explosion for flight safety reasons, and also the motor sections as they came. They were propellant, you know, and so those things had to be hard shelled structures. The essentials like the water tower, the utilities, all those things would be considered in more or less of a lump sum bundle, because they had to get there first and, as a nucleus. And the other ancillary support facilities, such as the one you showed me, it's a fire station, but we could have fire engines and things without a building per se to get things going.
Right. And there are some buildings that are quite large in square footage. I would think those require a little more effort than some.
Well, that's true, but however, there was two buildings that are still in existence, and they're cinder block. Now those were constructed by the Radio Corporation of America, RCA. Now there was a requirement to bring in two radars from Eglin Air Force Base, and these are firm, permanent stationed FPS-16 radars. So RCA was directed by the Air Force to relocate two of those facilities up to Green River. So RCA went and issued a contract to build two of those facilities, which are still in existence. The radars are gone, but the buildings are there. So those escaped the documentation, perhaps, of some extent, such as the dim gem things that you told me, that you showed me.
And tell me again the story about the colonel and his call about these radars. That's kind of a neat story.
Oh, how we got to, well, we had to have two radars up there for flight safety reasons, and we didn't have enough. White Sands didn't have enough radars to support Pershing and Green River and Fort Wingate and all of these. And there was an Air Force colonel in charge of the Air Force program, the Avery's program at the time. His name was Asa P. Whitmire. Asa P. Whitmire. And he was a no-nonsense colonel, neat guy. Anyway, he was telling our deputy commander, Colonel Bain, John Bain, that we need two radars up there, and I'll give them to you. And Colonel Bain said, well, gee whiz, yeah, but I just can't go out and contract just off the street. I have to advertise and bids, and it's going to take a long time for me to relocate buildings from Eglin Air Force Base to Green River. I can't do that, just like that. And Colonel Whitmire says, Colonel, can I use your telephone? So Colonel Whitmire got the telephone, calls RCA, and he says, move radar building such and such, and also radar building with a radar to Green River, and we'll talk details later, but do it, and do it now. Boom. And man, they did, just like that. So there's ways and means to do things.
So was the actual building moved?
Well, no, they were torn down and rebuilt. No, they just took the radar out,
okay,
and all of the ancillary electronics, and then they trucked them up while they were building the building, duplicating the ones that were left there.
Okay.
So there's two vacant buildings at Eglin, I'm sure.
And do you know where the radars ended up?
They ended up, believe it or not, at White Sands on trailers. We trailerized them.
Okay.
We at White Sands see the scenario in warfare has changed from 1950, 60, 70, even to now. You no longer have tanks and bayonets and things like that per se. You don't fight wars in trenches. It's a different world. But they're more sophisticated weapons, and those required low-level missile flights and things of that nature, and required more radars. So we, at White Sands, we got some incentive funding to relocate and trailerize the radars at Green River, because they were no longer useful. But each one of those radars costs, $20 million. Maybe not that much, but so we trailerized them, and then so they're still at White Sands probably.
Okay.
And because we have 7 trailerized FPS-16s at White Sands now, and so that's they didn't waste them, but there was a 500-foot tower for meteorological studies, because wind shear at the launch point was critical. So it was a 500-foot tower, and after the operations were completed, at Green River, that tower was relocated to Kwajalein Island in the South Pacific to support activity down there. So anything that could be utilized wasn't wasted, and so those radars are still there.
And this is backing up a bit, but this was a question of mine. Do you know where North Glen Camp is stationed or headquartered?
I don't recall. I believe it was somewhere in Oklahoma, but I don't remember.
Okay.
See, at that time, I was no longer involved, except by looking over my shoulder, because when the first concrete was poured at Green River was the last time I was there.
And you're an engineer, so did you have any, when you're laying out the complex, did you have oversight of that, or?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yes, indeed. Like I say, this on-site, Mr. Taylor, I was a supervisor in the post engineers, because at the time I was kind of a deputy post engineers before I went up to the command staff. So I was familiar with contracting buildings and designs, and so I wasn't the only one, of course. You had people like utility people and safety people and people like that were all involved. You know, no one person can do it all.
It's planning a city.
It was a staff. It was essentially planning a city. You're correct.
And let's see. I want to talk to you a little bit about the function of the mobile sites like Blanding and Gilson Butte and the other sites within Utah and on the flight corridor. What were their functions?
Well, it depends what you want to call flight corridor and things that happen there. That's what you're heading into. You know, back in 1956, the Air Force was launching the Matador and Mace missiles off of launch rails from Holloman, and then flying them all the way to Wendover in Utah, which was far beyond Green River. And those were kind of cruise missile type things, but they were more of a drone type of a weapon. So that was happening. And then the various launch points for the Pershing were required by the artillery board because they were trying to confirm the operational effectiveness of the entire weapon system, the Pershing 1A. And on the artillery board, like all old cannon cockers, they always had to have a table, firing tables they call them. And they go by clicks, by so many kilometers. And so you elevate, you know, like the old cannons. You still do that. But it was the same with the Pershing weapon system for its guidance, that it would be effective at different ranges, from minimum range to maximum range, to at high altitudes to low altitudes, to compensate for the geographic terrain difference in launch point and impact point. Things of that nature all had to be proven. For that reason, there were various launch points for the Pershing. And that included Fort Wingate, like I mentioned, from Fort Bliss into White Sands, from Blanding, from Gilson Butte, from Green River itself. But these were all conducted by operational troops who bivouacked. They didn't require, you know, nice soft pillows. And so they were done by operational troops. And they were mobile. Everything was mobile. And so they were, and all we had to do was get the flight safety concerns solved, and the FAA airspace was a very serious critical element in these operations, because we did have to temporarily punch through controlled traffic, air traffic, and we only had an hour's launch window to get in and out. You know, we just couldn't fire at will whenever we wanted to.
Right.
And so it was a highly orchestrated deal, and it still is. It's
And talk to me a little bit about the relocating of the Pershing 1A to Green River. That happened later.
Not really, not really. It just happens that they wanted to fire from a different angle and aspect angle and range. And Green River was not a launch. In other words, there was very little support from Green River for the Pershing launch at Green River. The radars were there, telemetry was there, emergency people were there, but it wasn't there for the Pershing. The Pershing just happened to be a walk-in, like you might say. The same thing was required at Blanding, at Fort Wingate. They required minimum technical support and very minimum logistic support. And it was all supported by White Sands Missile Range mobile instrumentation systems, which included meteorological, it included radars, it included telemetry, included communications, those essentials, and range control.
Okay, I'm going to back up a bit and talk a little bit, if you would, about the well-known Mexico incident with the Athena launch. I believe it was in 1970?
It was 1970, yes ma'am,
Okay.
in July.
Could you talk a little bit about that event?
I'll try to be as little about it as possible. Well, it was in the middle of the night. The Athena had to fire in the middle of the night, most of the time. And one of the reasons that required night firings was they had to get away from the solar effects from sunshine, radiation effects, and they also had to go through lunar darkness sometimes. It was a very sophisticated, complex scenario required for certain types of payloads. You know, they could sneak into the darker moon rather than full moon, you know, things like that.
Oh, right.
And so they were always done at night, most of the time. And at night there was less air traffic and it was easier to manage and conduct those operations. So there was one event and the missile was fired, and it kept on going. And flight safety realized, hey, something's wrong. And they couldn't cut it down. But then they realized it was going to fly over populated areas, and it wasn't endangering Alamogordo or El Paso, but it flew right into Mexico. Anyway, what had happened was that the fourth stage, it was a four-stage, 2 stages firing up and 2 stages, 2 motors firing down, pushing it fast. The fourth stage ignited before the third stage did, for some reason. And this caused the thing just to go all cockeyed. And it ended up about 530 miles into Mexico, north of the city of Torreon. And it had a radioactive payload, cobalt-57, a very small amount, but it was required for that particular test to determine the rate of ablative decomposition of the nose cone as it re-entered the atmosphere. By that I mean it would burn up, and the rate of its burning was being monitored by this cobalt-57. So anyhow, that's what happened there, and the consequences are very complicated in detail, but it was located and recovered, and we brought it back.
But you served as a liaison to the government.
I was the only one authorized to speak with the Republic of Mexico and its personnel, and I was representing the United States government, really. And I was the only one authorized to explain to Mexico what happened, why it happened, the details of the penetration of objects into the Republic of Mexico, the content of the objects, the composition of the payload, the details of the radioactive cobalt-57. And Mexico had assigned to their task to communicate with us for about 2 full colonels, and there was 5 engineers from their Nuclear Energy Commission, which are all very intelligent personnel. And so that was my role. And for 3 days I had to translate. We were allowed to go into Mexico, and a lieutenant colonel came with me, or I took him, and about 10 or 11 recovery personnel, that is enlisted men, sergeants and military enlisted men, had expertise in detonation and recovery of missile debris. So they were experts in finding things that had been impacted. And also there was a representative from the Air Force and the contractor in with the team that went in. And nevertheless, I was the only one authorized to communicate with Mexico in Spanish.
You were fluent in Spanish. So.
Oh, I had, yes, thank God for that. And but I had to translate. I had to translate what I spoke in Spanish back to the colonel and the staff, what I had said. And then they would come up with a comment that I would have to translate back to Mexico. So I was talking 24/7 there for about 3 days. And that didn't last too long, though. You know, everybody has a chink in their armor, and you start looking for it. And these 2 colonels, I realized they could speak English, and they liked beer and cognac, and I got them over a barrel one time, and they accepted my knowledge that they could speak English. They had gone to war college here. They were the liaison to NASA on terrestrial vehicle explorations in the Sonoran Desert, and they just kind of laughed. Well, so did I.
And these are the colonels from Mexico, right?
Yes. And the engineers from the Nuclear Energy Commission were also very proficient in English. So after that, we became a team.
And the resolution of this, how was this all resolved?
It was resolved that we ultimately, under very, very arduous conditions, we finally located it through no help from the United States government whatsoever, and I'm not ashamed to say it. The State Department didn't care, didn't show up, and we were even excluded from getting any support from the government on helicopters or anything. But it was a private American company that on its own flew in an aircraft with a Geiger counter on it, you might say. And that's how they found the payload after 2 weeks of us searching for it in the desert. And we found it, and we recovered it, and Mexico insisted that we clean up the site such that there was no residual radioactivity on the ground, which the White Sands finally did. But we got very little support from, or hardly any support from the United States government in that respect. We were on our own, and boy, thank God that Mexico assigned a Secret Service personnel to me. And had it not been for him, it would have been a far worse, harrowing experience.
Thank you. And ultimately, the significance of Green River. What do you think the significance of this site is?
The significance of the site doesn't have any significance. Let's put it that way. The significance of what took place there and the effectiveness of the tests and test results by having launched the Athena from there could have been satisfied from any other place within reason. So the site itself doesn't have any residual significance except it happened. and it was successful, and it was concluded. And the last firing was in 1974 of the Athena, or anything else up there. And it's been dormant ever since. So it did its thing, it served its purpose, and it's no longer significant in any respect.
But the program or the history that was made there, you consider the Athena a success?
Oh, indeed. There's no question about it.
And a significant event in military history.
Oh, well, yeah, in the Department of Defense, effectiveness of the delivery of intercontinental ballistic missile warheads in operational configuration and in actual deployment was enhanced, and the Athena program contributed significantly to the effectiveness and to its current capability, which is still in existence.
And the program, it was initially thought it would be a 2 to 3 year program.
Yes.
But it seems that testing for almost 15 years or close to, that's a fairly significant length for such a facility to operate.
Well, as in anything else, the ABRES program, like the more you learn, the more you realize that you have to learn more. And as you progressed, they said, hey, we've got to do better. And then there's countermeasures and countermeasures. So during this time, the Cold War with the Soviet Union was hot and heavy. And we were aware of many facets of what they could do and what they couldn't do or should do, shouldn't do. And they were on to us also. But so the effectiveness of the reentry payloads that we were developing in 1967, say, were worthless for application later on in 1975 because things happened and things changed. So a lot of the work that was done early was put aside, as, even if it worked, because new stuff was required, and later on they went on to full-scale testing, which was done somewhere else. So it was very significant, and so the contribution to the national defense effort from the tests at Green River is still in evidence today, and it's still a very valuable contribution. But the site itself is rather useless, I'll put it that way.
And I think that concludes my questions for you, at least today. I thank you for your time, Mr. Bustamante. It was nice.
You're welcome. It was interesting, and it was one of the most interesting phases of my career at White Sands. And I'm very fortunate to have been there during that time and having the chance to play the role that was played by everyone involved. It was a tremendous technical accomplishment by all the personnel at White Sands, which are highly qualified and to this day, pretty sharp people.
Thank you so much.